Hello, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who might be sitting at home right now thinking, oh my god, I have got a test in a few days and I have not studied a lick of my subject. Well, now here's your opportunity to get a quick cramming in well, for those of you who like to procrastinate. And if your subject happens to be on Mongolian warfare, or maybe part of a Mongolian course, then you're in luck. This is how the Mongols made war. The outline of this will be surrounding the makeup of the Mongolian army in its early and late periods. Early regarding the time of Genghis Khan and around surrounding his death. Late regarding his legacy, which is the Mongolian Empire. The next part will focus on tactics and strategy, how they were used, and how they adapted. The last part will be why they fought the way they did, regarding how the Mongolians used their horses and why they would use them in the first place. The Mongolian early army. That was out of context, never mind. The Mongolian army was comprised mostly of cavalry. About 4 out of every 10 Mongolian horsemen carried a lance, the rest carrying a bow. The lancers were comprised of mostly heavily armed infantry who were armed with a large lance. These men would be focusing on the melee combat, whereas the majority of the army would be skirmishing cavalry. They were broken up into primary units, mostly around 4 of them. The first group was the tens, second the hundreds, third thousands, and last but not least the tens of thousands, which were commanded by Genghis Khan's closest friends and allies. One of the biggest part of the Mongolian army's advantage that they had over everyone else was their ability to live off the land. Being a nomadic people, they were used to this. Thanks to their horses as well, they were able to live with no supply lines, making them one of the fastest armies in the world. This did have its drawbacks, however, as they were forced to stay in a constant state of motion, as to not pick the land bare and starve to death. As a result, it's seen as a snowball going down a hill, gaining power and strength as it goes, but once it stops for good. The late Mongolian army. Now, the Mongols were a very adaptable people. Unlike most other countries, they learned to accept things from the other cultures. This allowed them to use siege weapons that they did not have in the early stages. They also, after they conquered most of their empire, they were able to conscript levies, allowing them to fill up the ranks of their armies and protect their borders of their vast empire. And they used more infantry. As mentioned before, the early army was comprised mostly of cavalry. However, there was nowhere near enough horses to supply the vast army that they would need to control their empire. So they had to rely on infantry. And finally, gunpowder. Gunpowder was a huge part of their of their late empire. Reliable sources mention that they used weapons like flaming arrows with little bombs on the ends of them, as well as clay-potted bombs, which were devastating in the invasion of Japan, where the samurai had no defense against them. The Mongolian soldier. The Mongols were, as mentioned before, cavalry. Their weapons comprised of mostly a bow, sword or lance, and an axe. Their bows were made of laminated horn, wood, and sinew, and each rider was usually carrying 2 or 3 bows, one large one for shooting on land, and one small one for shooting off the horse. Now, the cavalry were very useful with their bows, as the bows were small composite bows, which allowed them to shoot over far distances with incredible accuracy and speed. Their swords were a curved scimitar, which were used for slashing attacks, very useful on the back of a horse, where the momentum will increase the power of the swing. Now, their horses were another batch of cookies altogether. The advantage of the Mongolian horses was that they were not only more numerous, but they were better in almost every way. They were stronger, faster, nimbler, and they were smaller. But despite their size, they were able to carry heavy loads. They also had incredible endurance, which was a huge contributing factor to the Mongolian success. They could outrun almost every other horse on the battlefield on a long distance run, which was very useful in a drawn out battle. However, they had a small disadvantage over shorter distances. However, considering the fact that the majority of their opponents carried heavy armor, this was not a huge factor. Other equipment that was a huge attribute to the soldier was the saddle. The Mongolians used stirrups, which allowed their soldiers to fire at a full 360 degrees in any direction by clamping their knees around the sides of their horses and keeping their feet steady. Training. The Mongols were trained at a very young age to shoot off of a horse and to shoot accurately. It was a part of their daily life, as they had to shoot off predators to protect their herds, and they made war with each other quite often. This gave them an edge over the less trained levies that the European armies were mostly comprised of. Finally, their use on the battlefield was devastating. Mongolian commanders made use of them with such efficiency that the enemy were not able to compare. The famed tactics of the Mongolian army. The first we shall look at is the feigned retreat. Now, the feigned retreat is a tactic which the Mongols used in order to lure their enemies to positions where they want them to be. For example, say the enemy was in a position on the high ground. That is not favorable for a cavalry charge. So, hurling insults and arrows at the enemy, they will lure them into a battlefield that more suits the Huns and their mobile cavalry. When this happens, the Mongols will eventually whittle down the enemy to nothing and eventually swarm them and kill them. Skirmishing. Skirmishing was the bread and butter of the Mongolian army. Due to the fact that they had a huge number of horse archers, this was a very viable tactic. The goal of skirmishing is to whittle down the enemy with arrows, while keeping a safe distance. The problem with this strategy, however, is most skirmishers are, not equipped enough to fight in a stand-up battle. So they have to keep a far distance. This issue means that if the enemy was to catch up, they would be cut to pieces. Enveloping. Now this was a very sound strategy, which the Mongols used at the Battle of Kiev. Enveloping is exactly as it sounds. You're surrounding the enemy with your numbers. Usually they would be superior, but the Mongols weren't always as lucky. However, at the Battle of Kiev, they were. Notice how the Mongols surround them on three sides. This is usually how it starts. Eventually the enemy will be drawn into the center, where they will be shot at from all three sides. However, that's just the beginning. With nowhere to point their shield, the only place for infantry is behind a shield. However, when you're being shot at from three sides, you can't point your shield three ways, leaving their backs and sides vulnerable. Now, slowly the Mongols begin to envelop, which means they're surrounding the enemy. In the Battle of Kiev, the Mongols did this exact strategy. Eventually, the enemy's numbers were whittled down to nothing. And when that happened, they sent in the troops to finish off the rest. Now, this battle is roughly 2 minutes long, so if you're not quite interested in this, skip ahead and you'll get to the rest of the PowerPoint. I will try to narrate as best I can. Now, you notice that there's a gap here. The enemy general managed to slip through. This was normal, which is why the enemy had the heavy cavalry to run down anyone who managed to escape. And right here, notice that the enemy tried to push through. While the Mongols, in their wisdom, kept a safe distance to keep their troops safe. The Mongols believed that all life among their people was valuable, so the deaths of their people in battle was a sad thing. So they tried to do their best to keep their men alive. Slowly, the envelopment began to crush the enemy. Eventually, in the corner, the enemy general will be killed, breaking the men. Once they were broken, they would flee in disarray, and the rest of the cavalry would charge the center, finishing off the rest. Now, remember that this is just a simulation. This is not actually how the battle would have happened. These are much neater formations than what would have happened.
The enemy general is fallen!
Here's where it begins. Already 3 groups have retreated, and a 4th, 5th, and soon 6th and 7th will follow. That's pretty much the whole battle right there. During the Battle of Kiev, the Mongols chased the survivors towards the river and slaughtered them. It was a very brutal tactic, but it was part of the Mongolian way. Their psychological warfare was just as important as their combat. Now, the final part of tactics is the adaptation. As mentioned before, the Mongols were a very adaptable people. They learned how to use siege equipment from their enemies and learned other tactics as well. They used gunpowder, which was a Chinese method of war, and the Mongols picked it up very effectively. Now, why they fought the way they did? Culture was a huge part. You see, the Mongols are a nomadic people, as I mentioned before. They live off the land, and they are in constant motion. This means that their society focuses on the horse. They treat horses like most civilizations would treat cows, pigs, or other domesticated creatures. They gained everything from horses. This included their milk, which they used also in shamanic rituals. They also got meat from the horses. They used the bones to make their bows. They used the hair to make the strings, as well as instruments. They used the skin to make the pelts surrounding the yurt, as well as clothes. And they used the hooves for other things. And the bones they also ate, the marrow. Everything was used, and the horses were a huge part of their culture. Horses were also used as a form of trade, which is not surprising considering how much they were worth. Psychological. The Mongols fought with pure brutality. They had a penchant for leaving no survivors and destroying entire cities. This was to send a message to future enemies that should you oppose the mighty Mongol horde, this will be your fate. It was incredibly successful, as many civilizations rather surrender than face Genghis Khan. And finally, geography. Mongolia is not a fertile land, despite how beautiful it may look in this picture. It's mountainy and hilly, as well as poor ground for crops, which is why they focused on herding. With this many horses that they use, it's no surprise that they were a very cavalry centered army. Now that is the end of the show, folks. If you found this hopefully successful, drop by a like and maybe I'll do another one later. See ya, folks.